Feel like allergies are really intense this season. Anybody else experiencing that? I've never had them before, and all of a sudden I have allergies. Very frustrating. And now I know why my grandmother used to mow on cough drops like they were going out of style. Okay. Everything seems like it seems like it's uneven. It's driving me crazy. Okay, there we go. All right. Sorry, guys. I'm catching up here today. You can relate, yeah. So welcome to our bi-weekly live Q&A sessions here, where this is our first one for May 2025. For those of you that are new, we host these live Q&As twice a month, typically on the first and third Thursday of the month at 3 p.m. New York time. And inside your student dashboard in the introductory section and or under the module that says live events and replays, you'll find the link to join us here. There will also be a link to add the calendar to your Google Scheduler if you want to receive more notifications and reminders. So today, I thought I might just dive right in. We had some questions that were submitted in advance, and that gives me a little extra time to formulate my responses. So those kind of structure our discussion, but I do like to create time and space for those of you that have joined me live to ask questions, and I will create moments of pause to make sure that I am addressing some of those. So please feel invited as I'm going through my notes to share your thoughts and reflections and also any additional questions that may be coming up for you as I go through. And of course, if you relate to any of what I'm sharing, please feel invited to share that as well. Okay. So the questions we're going to talk about in today's live stream, I'm just going to tell you the ones that I plan to discuss. And if we don't get to all of them, whatever was left gets bumped up to the top of next time we meet. So first, how might a secure person trigger an insecure partner? Is there a specific attachment style for a partner of an avoidant so that the avoidant heals faster? How can I talk about the emotional impact of an unproven complaint at work without sounding defensive or risking my job as a new faculty member? Am I showing emotional maturity or just gravitating towards a familiar dysfunction by staying with a partner who mirrors my trauma and whose violent threats I tend to excuse because I relate to it? How can I inspire them to improve? If I've previously overwhelmed my partner by sharing emotions or reacting with irritability, would a securely attached person still shut down for this long? And how can I repair the connection now that I've learned a healthier way to communicate? So all of these are really great questions. And again, as I'm going through, please feel invited to share your experiences as well in the chat. So the first one I'm going to tackle, and I am going to dig a little bit more in depth with this question because it does speak to communication and attachment styles, which is one of the things I really like to talk about, because I do think when we have attachment-informed communication, then improving our communication in many ways becomes a vehicle for trauma healing or trauma recovery. We are literally rewriting the scripts of our relationships. So I think that let's address the question one more time. I want to restate the shortened version, and then there's a little more detail. So how might a secure person unintentionally trigger someone with an insecure attachment style? So a little more detail was offered by our inquirer. How would a secure person trigger different insecure attachment styles and then respond to those attachment styles? I think my partner is secure, but I still get triggered more so in terms of not feeling worthy of love. My partner is very supportive and patient and takes care to word things so as to prevent me getting triggered. I believe a friend was secure until I sought reassurance and then was met with their dismissal and deflection. Is it about proximity, the gap being not so big between a secure and disorganized person versus an anxious and an avoidant person? Okay. So I would say this is particularly important if you're in a relationship where you have a partner who might be more grounded, consistent, and emotionally available, and yet you still find yourself spiraling or second guessing your worth. So in this segment, I want to point out a few key ideas. First, that secure partners can unintentionally trigger insecure partners, not because they are unsafe, but because their way of relating can highlight unmet attachment needs. Secondly, directness, calmness, and space giving, while can be meant to be supportive, it could be misinterpreted as rejection, criticism, or emotional abandonment. And then we have to look at more specifically how the different attachment styles can react in different ways because of their underlying limiting beliefs and narratives. So anxious partners tend to react more often with panic and a need for reassurance. Avoidant partners tend to react more often by shutting down or feeling smothered. And we have our disorganized, fearful avoidants, whom I call spice up lifers, who can sometimes feel simultaneously overwhelmed and abandoned at the same time. The other thing we want to take a look at, yes, proximity does matter in the sense that the closer the bond, the more deeply it can stir up unresolved wounds, in this case, perhaps around worthiness issues. The other thing we want to point out is that simple shifts in language can dramatically improve how supported, safe, and insecure a partner feels, right? So if we have attachment-informed language, we can sometimes buffer that effect. And therefore, it becomes a bridge to what we call co-regulation and repair, right? So that's when we are able to access the resource of our own and our partner's nervous systems in order to find a way to expand and hold uncomfortable feelings, not necessarily calm, suppress, or run away from them. Okay. So let's dig into this a little more deeply. Now, the first thing, even the most loving, grounded, and secure partner can sometimes say or do things that might feel triggering to somebody else with insecure attachment, not because of what they're doing, but because of how the person is receiving that and interpreting it. And that may be because the secure behavior to that person feels unfamiliar. And because it's unfamiliar, it might even be threatening, especially to the parts of us that learn to expect things like inconsistency, ambivalence, abandonment, or control as what real love is, right? Additionally, when we have an insecure attachment style, whatever the attachment style might be, we have it because we learned that emotional authenticity and openness was threatening. So any insecure attachment style mechanism evolved as a way to circumvent that threat. So when you start being emotionally authentic and open and vulnerable and honest, it's going to feel threatening. So for example, a secure partner tends to communicate more directly. But if you are used to being criticized or misunderstood, then a directness might land as harshness, right? A secure person, more often than not, tends to stay calm in a conflict, not dismissive, but calm. And if you tend to associate calmness with withdrawal or dismissiveness, then you might receive it as some kind of emotional distance. A secure partner might say, take your time. I trust that you'll figure it out and then come to me. Well, you might interpret that as you're being left alone or expected to carry the full emotional weight that you're struggling with on your own without support. So depending on your attachment style, those moments can stir up different types of fears. So if we look at anxious folks whom I call open hearts, they have a tendency to crave more closeness. And so when a partner says, I just need space to think, even in a secure way, the anxious partner might hear, I'm leaving you and you don't matter to me. Right? Avoidant partners tend to be more inclined towards personal autonomy and craving a sense of independence. So if a secure partner says, hey, I'd love to talk about this, or let's talk about our feelings, for them, it might land as you're trying to trap me in some kind of emotional obligation or neediness. Now we have our fearful, avoidant, or disorganized partners who expect both abandonment and some kind of emotional intrusion or manipulation. So if a secure partner shows up with genuine warmth, they may feel both overwhelmed and also suspicious. So now they create distance because that feels dangerous. Okay. And so this is also why proximity matters, because if you've been deeply wounded in your relationships, then safe love can paradoxically feel more threatening than the kind of dysfunction that you grew up with and that you're familiar with. So it might actually feel more triggering, but to be with someone who shows up in this more secure way than to be with someone who's dismissive, or than to be with someone who's really overly anxious and aggressive or pushy. Because being loved just reveals how much we've doubted our own lovability, right? So what do we do instead? Well, let's say that an anxious partner says something like, I feel like you're just not there for me anymore. So a common response might be, but I'm here, aren't I? I'm here for you. Why do you feel that way? Doesn't make any sense. So maybe that's a factual observation, but it's emotionally distant. So in this case, we might use a safe strategy and we might say, ouch, wow, it pains me to hear that you feel so alone, and I don't want that. How can we reconnect? Right? What would help to shift that for you? So we're just providing a little bit of validation, and we're offering a path to repair while being reassuring. We're not invalidating the feeling because we don't feel that way, right? We're accepting that the other person does feel that way, even though we don't. So we meet them where they're at. Another example, maybe they say something like, it seems like you're upset with me and I don't know why. So instead of saying something like, I'm not upset, why would you always assume the worst? You might say, you know what, I can see how you think I might be off. I'm not upset with you, I'm just processing something from work. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk about it, right? So with these reframes, we're trying to offer a feeling of reassurance and safety while validating someone's emotions, even if we don't feel the same way about that thing. And we're doing it with our words, yes, but we're also doing it with our tone of voice, with our body language, and just our overall energy, right? The way we're showing up to that situation. Now, if you feel like you're the one that gets triggered, you might say something like this with your partner. Sometimes when you respond calmly or logically, my nervous system doesn't register that as care because in the past, calmness meant distance. And even though I know you love me, there's still a part of me that hears like you're saying I'm too much. So what would help me is a little extra softness, even something like I'm here and I want to be here with you through this might help me calm down. So would you be open to experimenting with something like that? And even if you're unsure, I think I'd rather have this approach and talk it out with you rather than spiral silently. So that's just a demo of what a repair frame, like offering a pre-frame for that conversation. That's like a pre-frame of what we might offer for a reparative conversation. And that kind of repair is possible. And it can be really transformational if we're able to do this with a sensitivity to our own triggers and to the triggers of our partner. So I hope that that helps and explains how an individual could be triggered even by secure overtures, right? But let me know, for those of you that are here, does any of this sound familiar? Can you resonate with this? I'd love to know where this is landing with you. Thank you for your important work. It helps. I want to be a secure person, but I'm definitely on the anxious side. Yeah. So one thing I might offer is we often have this perception of being secure means you're not anxious, right? But even secure people get anxious, and even so secure people, anxiety and avoidance are just two expressions of the sympathetic nervous system experiencing a sense of threat in the connections around you, or perceived threat in the attachment connections around you. So it's normal to have anxious or avoidant responses to something. That's the fight or flight response getting kicked up. This is a normal thing. It's how our body mitigates safety for us, mental, emotional, physical safety. So secure people have anxious and avoidant responses as well because they need to have a functioning sympathetic nervous system in order to survive really as much as we do, right? Relationships and other aspects of their lives. So to become secure doesn't mean that you're not anxious anymore. It just means that we've changed our relationship to our anxiety. So we just don't hang out there as long. We still feel anxious. We may still have some of those narratives that stay with us, sometimes for a lifetime. But every time we revisit those stories, we gain a broader perspective. We have a wider circumference around the sun. And each time around, we're like, oh, there's that daddy issue again. There's that mommy issue again. And there's a little frustration that it's coming up, but now I know it's coming up because here I am having changed my relationship to that. And now it's coming up because I have this opportunity to see and understand it and integrate it in a new way with greater maturity and sophistication. And that is why I believe that our relationships are really assignments for soul expansion, right? So we don't have to be burdened by this idea of eliminating anxiety. That's that to become secure. That's not what we need to do. We change our relationship to that anxiety. And this is where parts work becomes really helpful. If you've ever heard of inner child healing, Richard Schwartz developed a system called internal family systems theory, and it was an extension of that idea. So not only do you have a younger part of you that's kind of hanging out in your unconscious mind and body, kind of pulling your strings from behind the curtain, especially when you fall into patterns, triggered patterns in relationships, right? This is that younger part of you getting stimulated. Richard Schwartz proposed that we also have parts that satellite around that inner child. So you'll have a protector, you'll have, he calls them managers and firefighters, but in essence, they are parts that protect that inner child either by sort of being proactive. So a proactive protector would be somewhat critical, right? Don't do that because if you do that and fail, then we'll be exposed to everyone as a failure and that will feel shameful and nobody wants to feel shameful, right? So that's a proactive protector. Then they have what we call firefighters, which are parts that kind of swoop in to distance, douse, and distract us from the feeling we're having. You know what? You tried and failed, but we don't need to feel that shame. Let's just swipe right and get a rebound relationship to take our mind off it, or binge watch Netflix and eat Tom and Jerry's to our heart's delight, right? So there are different ways in which we start to change our relationship to our anxiety by first recognizing what are the parts surrounding it, right? So if there's a part that tells you if you're anxious, you're not secure. So we have to talk to that part first, right? Because I like to believe that we are all secure already. There's just parts of us that got confused along the way and we have to straighten them out, right? And by doing that, it is recognizing that that anxiety was not dysfunctional originally, that we grew up in an environment that called for a certain way of frequency of thought, feeling, and behavior, right? Anxious thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, avoidant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, disorganized thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, because our temperament in combination with the environments in which we grew up determined that that was the most functional and effective way to survive that environment. And so your brain, existing at the level of cognitive development it does as a child, learned this is the best way to be in order to get what I need to survive. This is why we say we get caught in survival mode, right? But what happens is as you grow up, you also develop all these other skills, observations, beliefs, and capacities. And so that original belief or perception in our child becomes kind of compartmentalized and condensed within you, and like it's like a knot in a tree. And so you continue to grow up and around that knot and you bear fruit and you succeed at things and you accomplish stuff, and maybe your relationships are a struggle, but you're performing really well in a lot of other areas of your life, right? But I believe that our attention turns towards that knot once we have arrived at a place where we have developed the capacity that now we can look at that and we can change our relationship to the anxiety, because the anxiety, its ability to perceive its benefit to us needs to be adjusted, right? So yes, that was the most functional way to be in a dysfunctional environment, but our environment has changed. So you have to go in and you got to tell that employee, hey, look, I'm not trying to fire you. I'm trying to promote you. The way that we were moving through the world, man, you worked so hard and you got this company so far, but we're doing a performance evaluation now. We see you've got all these skills that we think would be excellent for this new, higher, leveled up position that we think you'd be great for. So how do you think you can take those skills and transform them and apply them to this new vision that we have for the company? We're not trying to fire you. We're not giving you a bad evaluation. We're trying to promote you. Do you want to get on board with that vision? And so now, whatever skills, abilities, and strengths that anxiety afforded you, they're going to be transformed and integrated, and your relationship is going to change because that part of you feels acknowledged now. You're not trying to push it, get rid of it, dismiss it. This is the bad part of me. Now we're like, oh no, this is a celebrated part of me. And now I recognize that and I can give it its due and I can invite it into this new vision for our future. And this is when you start to, that's when that feeling of self evolves. Now we start to feel a little bit more that the different parts at war within us become a little more harmonious, right? They start cooperating. So I just wanted to maybe offer that because it doesn't mean we have to eliminate anxiety or avoidance. It means we have to be in conversation with it and just adjust our relationship to it. It can be so difficult to sort through what's really happening and what's historical or implicit memory and a reaction. Sure, yeah. I definitely resonate with it. Explains why it can be so hard to stay constructive from my triggers. You explain that so well and it helps. Oh, I'm glad that's helpful. Yeah. Okay, so let's see, we had another question here. Is there a specific attachment style for a partner who has avoidant attachment so that they can heal faster? Okay. So the short answer is, there really isn't one attachment style that guarantees faster healing because healing is really about a confluence of things, divine timing and readiness for change, I believe. And when people are ready for change is when they are more open and willing and receptive to however a partner might show up with that spirit of generosity, whether they're secure, anxious, or avoidant and working on themselves or willing to be in a process, right, of self-evaluation and accountability and generosity regardless of what attachment style they have, if someone's willing to be in that process, then they're in a state of readiness. And when we're in a state of readiness, the universe responds and divine timing gets turned on. And now we attract a relationship which can be catalytic, usually, is what happens first. You get a catalyzing relationship that forces you to look at all your stuff, and people think they're doing something wrong, but it usually means you were doing something right, so that you were finally able to allow in something that compelled you to look at all this stuff and clean out the dusty corners so you can receive and invite in the massive flow of energy that you are requesting when you say you want a loving relationship, right? Well, I got to look at all the areas where I'm not really loving myself because what does that do? That pinches me off from what I'm asking for. It prevents it from getting in. So at first we have to consider that there are stages of readiness for change, regardless of your attachment style. There's completely unaware. So this is when we're sort of ping-ponging through life. We don't really feel like we have a sense of agency over ourselves. Everything is everybody else's fault. And there's not a lot of awareness of the patterns that we might be repeating over and over again. Then there is aware but unwilling to do anything about it. So we have this burgeoning insight into what's going on with us, but we don't have a sense of motivation or desire to really change it because we're still too constricted by fear and the familiar, right? Then there's aware and making plans. So you're making a plan to do something about it. You're starting to formulate that in your mind. There is making plans, and then there's taking action on those plans. So now you've actually gone ahead and taken action and you're doing something about it. Then there's maintenance. So now you're repeatedly taking that action and you're doing it repeatedly enough that it becomes a consistent change, transformation, reward. And now you continue taking the action because the rewards start to justify themselves, right? So that's a combination of divine timing and readiness for change, right? So first we want to be aware of that because it allows us to become increasingly aware of the extent of what I can control and what I can't control. So I can show up with a spirit of generosity. I can show up with having learned all the attachment informed communication skills that I can. I can show up taking accountability for my part in things. I can show up being in a process of self-examination and evaluation and becoming increasingly aware of how I move through and or take up space. And then I can extend an invitation to someone else to participate in my emotional experiences while still retaining enough personal emotional discipline and control to know that I'm not going to hand it all over to them, right? That's how you show up. And then they have to be willing to accept that. You can bang on the door, but they have to be willing to open it for you. Divine timing and readiness for change, right? Divine timing, the messenger shows up. Readiness for change, you open the door, okay? Now, the other thing that can sometimes happen in the course of things is you can have someone who circles around making plans, taking action on the plans, and then we have relapse. Relapse, that's the formal term, right? Trans-theoretical model for change. But it just means that we kind of go, whoop, I went too far, and then we go running back to the middle of our comfort zone. And then we kind of have to go through that cycle a few times before we can consistently stretch the boundaries of our comfort zone so that we are inhabiting a new expansion of existence, right? A new and expanded way of being. So this can kind of be like maybe you have a partner who said that they recognize a need for change, they want to change, they make a plan for change, and maybe they go to a couple counseling sessions with you. And there's this sense of relief, right? The connection feels established again for a month or two. They are making change. Now I can feel good about my decision to stick it out and to be patient and to wait. And then what happens is that lasts for X amount of time, and all of a sudden things get too busy. You start canceling this. Oh, we're doing fine. We can cancel the session. Or things start to slide back to where they were before. And so this is kind of like, and it happens a lot leading up to the maintenance phase. It's sort of like you're in a hot car, right? You're in a car, the windows are rolled up, and the sun is beating down, and it just keeps getting hotter and hotter, and there's no ventilation. And so finally, you are in there until you absolutely cannot stand it. And then you roll the window down, and all the hot air blows out. And you have a sigh of relief. And then before long, you're rolling the window back up. And then you sit there, and guess what happens? The car heats up again. And you wait until it comes up to here and you can't stand it anymore. And then you roll the window down, go to another couple counseling sessions. Maybe it was the therapist's fault. Go to a new therapist, go to a weekend workshop, what have you. Wind goes out. Ah, that's a relief. And then what do? Do you move the car into the shade? Do you turn on the air conditioner? Do you get out of the car? No. You roll the window back up and wait until you get back up to here again, right? And so this is someone who appears to be taking action on those plans, but they're not maintaining them and they're not going all the way. So they're actually really kind of stuck in the making plans, but not really willing to do anything about them, right? And the only way you can kind of discern that is time. You got to give it time. And oftentimes you have to give yourself boundaries around how much time it's going to be. Now, bringing it back to the original question, what kind of partner, supports faster healing for avoidant partners? So a lot of people think that what avoidant partners really need is space. But space is kind of code for, I need to roll the window down and let the air out, right? And then I'm just going to roll it right back up. So space is really only effective if it's being used to process what you're doing. Space is only effective if you roll down the window, spot a piece of shade, and then drive the car and park it under there, right? Or turn on the air conditioner. Space, if it's just being used to roll down the window, let the air out so you can roll it right back up, that's not going to be effective, right? So it's kind of like for avoidant partners, they ask for space because they're so overwhelmed. So it's like, oh, there's a tornado inside of me, and the only thing I know how to do is run from it. But if you're in a tornado, you're not supposed to run. You're supposed to lay down flat and stay grounded. And that's really what our Rolling Stone partners need, this kind of grounded emotional space where they don't have to run, but they're not being forced to perform some kind of emotional vulnerability before they're ready or have really developed the tools to do that in a masterful way, or even just in a minimally effective way. So, what we know from research and therapeutic practice is that secure or insecure partners tend to show up with consistent warmth and compassion without too much pressure. They are able to express some kind of their own emotional self-discipline, which creates a sense of safety, and feeling like things are not being demanded of you. And they are sort of intuitively capable of extending these safe and soft invitations to closeness that don't provoke the avoidance fear of engulfment. Now, for avoidant partners, tends to be more the soft strategies in communication, right? So soft strategies are when we express appreciation, we acknowledge someone's autonomy, and we offer them choices. So basically, secure partners tend to kind of just have a natural sense of how to communicate emotional freedom and connection. They model what that looks like without requiring immediate reciprocity. And so that can encourage an avoidant partner to stay in the relationship, even though they're maybe working through some of their fears. But I think sometimes what's often missed, and especially in the attachment literature, they often talk about avoidance being oriented to fear of other. But I don't think they're just afraid of other. I think they also don't trust themselves. They don't really trust themselves to stay regulated, to be boundaried, and to be emotionally whole and accessible within themselves and by extension in their relationships. A lot of times they've spent decades suppressing their emotions, so they don't know how to access them. They don't know how to name them. They don't know how to articulate them. And so that when we push them to express their emotion, it becomes out as an explosion, this kind of confused, entangled mess. And they know, oftentimes, many avoidants that I've worked with, they know that on an intrinsic level. They know that's what's going on inside of them, but they don't have the tools to change anything about it. So if I express what I feel, it's going to lay waste. So I'm going to pull back and remove myself in order to protect the connection that we have. Because if I were to express it, I know I would destroy this, right? So then they shut down during emotional moments. They wind up feeling pushed around by somebody else's emotional needs. And then they'll use things like deactivating strategies, which can look like stonewalling or, sarcasm, dismissal, rigid boundaries, that kind of thing. So, healing that isn't just about finding the right partner. It's about helping the individual, and in this case, someone who has a Rolling Stone avoidant attachment style, recovery their own capacity for emotional openness and for establishing healthy enough boundaries that they can invite someone to participate in their emotional experiences without a fear of losing themselves in it, right? So whether you are the avoidant partner or you're supporting one, I like to suggest four things. There's many things, but in this little segment here, let's just talk about four things that I think would assist for healing any really single attachment, any attachment pairing. So first, and I think this is true for avoidant partners especially, but I would say it's true for all insecure attachment style. We need to reclaim playfulness and creativity. So in this case, avoidant attachment forms in part because emotional needs were neglected or punished in childhood for some reason. And so what that does is it constricts and it stunts the natural joy, curiosity, and movement that a child has. And so that it becomes that knot in the tree. So we have to recover that. We have to untangle that knot. And we do that by learning how to laugh more easily, how to play in relationships, be spontaneous, allow for mistakes and imperfection, right? Reconnect with that joy through our own vital life force energy through things like art and movement and music and metaphor and dance or storytelling. So in my work as a creative arts therapist, I use things like scribble drawings or imaginative dialogues movement, somatic guided visualizations, because these are ways that we can allow the unconscious to speak to us without those defended, highly defended parts, which are often intellectual and verbal, kind of getting in the way. So we're able to very gently and playfully and joyfully bypass these defenses so that they can start to access their feelings in a fun way, not in a confrontational way, so that it feels safe, right? So that, wow, I was afraid of feeling that feeling, but here I've done it, and it was actually kind of a fun exploration process, and maybe I would feel safe doing that again, right? And that leads to the second step, which is now we are starting to develop self-trust. Well, if I can trust that my feelings aren't going to take me over, if I can trust that they're not going to explode in a destructive way, maybe I can trust myself to have those feelings and even organize and be in charge of them in a different way. So our avoidant rolling stones, they don't avoid to avoid you, right? They're not pulling away because they're trying to avoid you. It's more often than not that they're trying to avoid that sense of inner overwhelm that they feel when somebody is wanting something emotionally from them. But when we can start to build that self-trust, now they can learn how to stay connected, even in an argument. They can recognize that they're not going to lose themselves by showing up emotionally or extending emotional invitations. And their boundaries go from being rigid but fragile to more flexible and firm, right? Because people tend to think, well, avoidants have emotional brick walls. Not really. It's more like crystal. It's fragile. It's hard, but it's fragile. And that is why they are so sensitive to things like constructive feedback or bids for connection, because it feels like you're knocking on a glass wall with a hammer. And they have to move away. Otherwise, what does exist there will fall, and that's not to the detriment of all involved, right? So once they start to trust themselves, those become firm but flexible boundaries instead. And now we can start to allow invitations for emotional sharing and connection. And that's the foundation of co-regulation, meaning now we get to resource each other's nervous systems to build a third thing between us in this relationship that feels pretty amazing, right? It's a support for us. That's the second thing. So once again, the first thing was reclaim our playfulness and creativity. The second thing is, as a result of that, we're starting to develop self-trust. And the third thing, this is leading us into that creation of flexible and healthy boundaries, right? Now we're starting to establish those a little more intentionality. So again, I don't believe avoidants have too many boundaries. They have rigid but fragile and oftentimes confused ones, right? So when they encounter a secure partner, sometimes it's easier for them to work with evolving that or negotiating that, because secure partners tend to have a language and a sort of intuitive way of making respectful requests. They have been able in their life to have boundary conversations without sounding dismissive, shameful, or controlling or demanding. And they view conflicts as opportunities to be curious about the real needs of their partner, rather than a sign that it must not be meant to be or it's never going to work. So they can approach reparative conversations by establishing healthy boundaries rather than issuing ultimatums, right? And through that process, now we have our avoidant rolling stones starting to learn that boundaries don't equate rejection or enmeshment, that they can be tools for exploring that gray space in between, which becomes a shared space, right? And lastly, step 4, now that we've established those boundaries, right, we are able to play, we've developed some self-trust, we're establishing boundaries. Now we get to practice healthy communication. And going back to what I said before, a lot of avoidant partners don't know what they're feeling, much less how to talk about it, name it, claim it, say it, ask for some kind of solution or soothing. What they know is they've got big energy. And I don't know how to modulate that big energy, so I have to pull away until I roll down the window and the energy diffuses a little bit. And that's why, the sort of traditional advice, like just learn to be more honest, right? Or just learn to say, I feel XYZ. That advice can fall flat for them. So really, there is some skill building and the acquisition of certain tools at this point, which are helpful, which is what I offer in my course, The Courageous Communicator and Others. Learning communication skills and languaging, which are tools that can help us bypass defensiveness, not because we're trying to invade upon someone or manipulate them, but because we want to connect with the other parts inside of them that do want connection, that feel lonely and isolated, that question if love is really possible for them. And we have these protective, defensive parts that kind of loom in front of them and don't allow us to access those other parts. But those softer parts, that's what's going to help them grow. That's what's going to help them escape that isolation. So we can learn and acquire tools in compassionate and I call courageous communication that allow us to access those softer parts. And we can learn these more structured ways to express our needs without assigning judgment or shame to them. And in my work, I call it the HIP communication formula. But the way I teach this, we have a three-part process, and that is healing our conflict blueprints, inspiring devotion, and practicing emotional intimacy. And so this is when we are learning about what triggers us and how can we change those narratives. What are the elements of compassionate and courageous communication? And how can we use attachment-informed things like safe and soft strategies to have more of those conversations and inspire devotion as a result of it? What are our real goals with communication? Is it to strategize to get them to do something, to manipulate the situation in some way? Or are our goals for communication really more about healing and self-advocacy and knowing the extent of what we can and cannot control? What we can invite versus what we're trying to force, right? So we become a lot clearer around that. And then, of course, now once we're clear, we can assess what is the real compatibility here. Because sometimes it's attachment anxiety keeping you together, it's a pattern keeping you together, and that's where the chemistry comes from, not from a real soul-centered place of compatibility. In other words, the curriculum that is going to light you up in this lifetime and really contribute to an expanded consciousness, an expanded way of being. And if you're here, you're interested in that, right? So in essence, for avoidant partners specifically, how they heal, they have to learn to speak from their deeper emotional body, not just their logical mind or their intellect, because that's typically where all the defenses hang out. And that really starts by learning how to speak the language of emotion. And in my work, we do that creatively. So we develop a visual language. We develop an emotional language using symbols and other metaphorical, what we call them, apparatuses or tools, so that we use nonverbal but creative forms of expression to articulate that big energy that we're carrying. And as we start to articulate an energy with movement, with sound, with drawing, with shape, with color, with identifying where it is in the body, by scrunching it, by exploding it. Now we've got all these different ways of feeling the feeling without having to articulate it. And then now we've got access in a safe way. We've got a sense of self that doesn't have to be formed by words just yet. But once we do that over and over, now we can start assigning words to that. Well, what does this feel like? If I had to describe this in one word, what would it be? Right? If there were a song that would feel the way I feel right now, what song would that be? And what are some of the words in that song that I could rearrange to articulate this in a better way? That's how we help our delightful Rolling Stones connect to themselves and trust themselves again so they can trust themselves with you, right? Okay, so bringing this back, what kind of partner helps an avoidant heal fastest? Well, I would say a partner who brings curiosity, consistency, and compassion, not chaos or over control. A partner who doesn't demand vulnerability, but invites it playfully and patiently. And a partner who knows that healing avoidant attachment isn't about fixing themselves or the other, it's about becoming a safe witness to the healing that's already going to happen or trying to happen, right? someone who's willing to be in process. Now, of course, on the part of the avoidant partner, they have to be in a stage of readiness for change. That's not something you can control. That's something they control, right? And when they communicate to you what their stage of readiness for change is, not just in word, but in action, that's important information for you, right? Okay. Now, if you are the person who is, let's say, the secure functioning partner, just remember you're not responsible for their growth, but you can invite and support it. You may still trigger their defenses, even if you're showing up and saying all the right things. That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Sometimes it means you might be doing everything right. Because remember, emotional authenticity, honesty, and vulnerability was declared wrong and threatening at some point. That's why they're avoidant. So, in fact, doing things right could trigger them. And your steadiness, that might be the first real taste of safety that they've ever had. Okay. So I hope that that helps. And if any of this is landing with you or any other questions popping up, I would love to see that in the chat or in the comments there. Let me know. Okay, I went a little longer on that than I anticipated. We've got another question about a workplace issue. Okay. So the Courageous Communicator is the course where we teach specific safe and soft strategies and emotional articulation. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so let's talk about this one. How can I talk about the emotional impact of an unproven complaint at work without sounding defensive or risking my job as a new faculty member? Okay. So as a little bit of detail, I'm a new teacher, and last semester I awarded 12 A's in one of my English classes. Unfortunately, someone on the team noticed the grade distribution and thought they should bring it to the administration's attention without speaking to me directly. As a result, I was called into a meeting and asked to attend training sessions with the department chair. During those sessions, we reviewed my students' essays week by week and discussed the course in depth. I accepted this process openly as I have always had nothing to hide and am committed to improving my teaching. By the end of the semester, I believe it became clear that the concern may have been handled prematurely, without a conversation with me first. I do not dismiss the possibility that the grade distribution may have raised questions. However, I was quickly perceived as a poor instructor, and that was difficult to experience. I would like the opportunity to clarify how the situation affected me, especially because it could have been approached more constructively. I'll have a meeting with the department chair next week as I'm writing my continuing employment document for next year, and we will meet to strategize it. I wonder if and how I should bring up how it was poorly handled. I want the job, and they probably want to keep me as well. Okay. So from a therapeutic lens, I would say the experience probably isn't just about grades or teaching evaluations. I would say in many ways, it's kind of about relational safety and how we process ruptures in trust. So when you're in a new role and someone raises a concern about your performance without speaking to you directly, that can evoke a sense of invisibility or even shame, maybe even betrayal. And it's not uncommon to internalize something like, these people assume the worst of me before even getting to know me or giving me a chance to justify myself. And that is an emotional response, which I think is completely valid and understandable in this circumstance, particularly as a new faculty person. So in this case, I would say you did exactly what someone with integrity and who has a growth orientation would do, is you leaned into it. You participated openly in the review, you welcomed feedback, and demonstrated humility and a willingness to improve if necessary. But I agree, I think it's also healthy to acknowledge that the process lacked a kind of respectful human-to-human communication that would really build trust for you in that academic culture. So I think at this point, it's kind of about advocating for a culture of safety and mutual respect, right? So I might phrase this. Here's just a recommendation for how I might phrase it. I am a wordy person. So here's just a structure that I'd like to offer. And you can, of course, word this in a way that feels truer to your voice and language. I want to acknowledge that I understand how my grade distribution could have raised questions, and I welcome the opportunity to reflect on my teaching through the review process. I am committed to continual growth and I took the training session seriously. That said, the way the concern was initially handled without a direct conversation was heartbreaking. It led to assumptions about my competence before I had a chance to be a part of that conversation, and that was demoralizing. I'd like to express that not because I'm holding a grudge, but because I believe in open collegial dialogue, and I think it's essential for a healthy department culture, especially for new faculty. So I hope that we can use this experience to improve communication going forward. And I'm invested in contributing meaningfully here and growing as an educator. And I believe that we're all on the same side in that effort. So the goal here is really to affirm your professionalism, validate your experience, and position yourself as someone who not just wants the job, but you also want to help shape a better culture, right? The other thing I would add here is that the situation, it kind of reveals not just a look at a relational dynamic, but it's also telling you something about the institutional culture. Because it seems likely that the issue wasn't just that there was X number of A's, awarded, but that those grades symbolized something to someone in a position of authority. And a positive grade distribution can trigger some individuals, especially those that have a punitive or rigid view of merit, right? They suspect it's indulgent rather than as a sign of student success or effective teaching. So I think it is worthwhile considering that what if the distribution had been 12 C's that you had given out? I doubt that the same alarms would have been raised. And so that suggests that it was flagged not as an imbalance or some kind of, criticism of your teaching, but because there's a cultural bias in the institution that leans towards mistrusting reward and defaulting to suspicion rather than curiosity or an inquiry. So in that sense, it may reflect not just a systemic or policy issue, but it is a dynamic that's being shaped by the people in power, right? In that in that academic system, and they feel threatened by what they perceive to be deviations, like a high grade, um, deviations from what is probably more likely a rigid system of control and distribution of merit, right? So cultures like that, if they're unexamined, can discourage innovation. They penalize warmth or generosity in teaching, and they can isolate new faculty members who are trying to find their footing. So I would maybe caution you to be aware of, even though it was a systemic response, there was a protocol put in place and you had to meet for X number of sessions even before it was even approached with you personally. That sounds like you may have one person in that system who has a rigid disposition, and it may also behoove you to be mindful of who that person is, because if they are in a position of power, you may have to learn how to negotiate that through the culture of the academic environment that you reside in, because it may not be something that is necessarily resolved through this incident. It may come up again in a different way, in which case you'll have to be mindful. Okay, so I hope that helps. And Paula, let me know how that's landing with you. Okay, we have a little bit of time left. Let's see. Okay, over empathic. Okay, I think we can get this one before we end. Am I showing emotional maturity or just gravitating towards a familiar dysfunction by staying with a partner who mirrors my trauma and whose violent threats I excuse because I relate to it? How can I inspire them to improve? Okay, so a little more detail. I went from dating an avoidantly attached person to an anxiously attached person. I noticed that my anxiously attached partner struggles with the same things that I do, and so I'm able to give him a lot of grace and forgiveness when he explodes during fights. He is essentially me. Same violent childhood, same patterns and compulsions when getting angry, and etc. Recently, he took it so far as to threaten to physically beat up a male friend of mine because he knows that friend likes me a little more than friends. My friend almost turned him into the medical board for the threats that he made. It's one thing when I deal with his catastrophizing antics and explosive anger because I struggle with the same thing and view it differently. It's less personal to me. Does it mean that I am emotionally mature, or does it mean that my nervous system values the familiar? I love the benefits of an anxious person, lots of reassurance, which is what I need and give freely. Lots of talking about our anger and emotion and healing. Lots of accountability as we're both very self-aware in our destructive parts, but oddly always forgiving of each other. I'm further ahead of his healing journey and wonder how I can inspire him to get help too. So this is just such a powerful and raw question. Does it mean I'm emotionally mature that I can give my anxious partner grace during his explosions, or am I just familiar with chaos? So I would say the answer is probably a little bit of both. And it takes a high level of emotional awareness to see your partner as a mirror and not to personalize their wounds. So to me, that's a sign of emotional maturity and sophistication. But also, it's important to realize that familiar doesn't always mean safe, appropriate, or acceptable. Now, many of us who grew up in violent or emotionally volatile homes will have nervous systems that respond to chaos with recognition. It feels like home, even when it hurts. And so when you say, he's me, that's a really important insight because it's kind of an enmeshed perspective. You might have similar backgrounds and so on and so forth, but he's not you. You have a lot of similarities, but you have differences too. And so it means that while this is a valuable insight, it doesn't mean that the two of you are really aligned. So you might love each other very deeply, but if one person's nervous system is still weaponizing those wounds, like making violent threats, that's no longer about mirroring. That is about emotional and physical safety and boundary issues. So here's, let's call it the edge of your growth, right? Here's the growth edge for you. Perhaps to this point, you've been the good girl. You are emotionally generous, self-sacrificing, always forgiving the partner because you can relate to what they're going through. But now it's time to meet your inner bad girl, right? Not the villain, but the boundary keeper. The one who says, I love you and I understand where you're coming from. But that understanding doesn't excuse the impact of your behaviors on me, my life, and my friends. And I'm not going to let you burn down my friendships, my emotional peace, or your own future because you haven't gotten the help that you need. So this part of you might feel mean at first establishing a boundary like that because anxious partners are often conditioned to equate love with some degree of accommodation. But real love says no, right? Real love has to include what's good for you, especially when that no is what saves the relationship from imploding, right? Because if you're being cut off from your friends, that's not serving you, therefore it's not serving the relationship either. So I would assume that you're already inspiring him through your generosity, your empathy, and your grace. But you offer him the opportunity to really transform when you show up with healthier boundaries. So you're not going to be able to teach someone how to self-regulate by absorbing their chaos. You teach them how to do that by protecting your own peace. And if he is as self-aware as you say he is, then he'll know that your boundary is not a rejection, it's an invitation to step into his next level of healing right alongside of you, not at the cost of you. Okay. So I hope that that helps. We do have one more question we didn't get a chance to address today about having a history of oversharing emotions, learning new communication skills, but now the partner is shut down, and how do you move on from here? So we will bring that question up at the top of the hour at the end of the month when we meet again. So thank you everyone for joining me here today, that joined me here in the live space. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing you next time. And if you have questions between now and then, you can always pop into our Facebook group and you can tag me. And I typically respond within 48 hours, or Bezam, our group moderator, will let me know. And we've also started a new thing. We've started doing weekly wisdom check-ins. So every Tuesday this month at 3 p.m., we're going to pop in for about 10 to 15 minutes and talk a little bit about boundaries and also take a look at what's going on in the group, what questions are coming up, and try to address some of that in a more consistent way and more frequent way. So take a peek inside the group, and this replay will be there as well once the recording is processed. So thank you, everyone. The Facebook group is available for all of our students and alumni. You have lifetime access to it. Just log into your student dashboard and the link to join will be there. Thank you, everyone. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your week.